Part 2 of our lesson on the Gilded Age is going to focus on the North. So that's kind of our remaining region that we have to talk about. And in a lot of ways, the North is the most dynamic of all the three regions. There's a lot of things happening in the North. And so the major characteristic is really the economic characteristic of what's going on in the North, which is this second wave of industrialization. So the Gilded Age is a big era of industrialization for America. And if you look here, this is really where America becomes the industrial powerhouse of the world. So in 1880, we have about 14% or 15% of the world's manufacturing done in the United States. By the end of this era, by 1913, we have about 32%. So we really become an economic powerhouse as far as manufacturing is concerned. And you see that carry over all the way into World War II, which is one of our greatest assets, during World War I and World War II. So we're really changing. We're transitioning economically from an agrarian society even into more of an urban and industrial manufacturing society. So you saw that started in the market revolution and continuing here in this age of industrialization. Now, there's a couple of different reasons for this. So one big reason is a lot of the inventiveness during the time period of Americans. So we call this the idea of American ingenuity. And if you look here, look at the amount of patents being issued by decade and how they're increasing every single decade tremendously. So most famous inventor of the time period is Thomas Edison. And he invents all different kinds of things, everything from, the light bulb to motion picture camera, to all different things that become like main aspects of American culture and society. So like America is beginning the electrification of our urban areas and bringing all different kinds of new technology. And this is driving industrialization as we're developing bigger and better machines to produce things on a mass scale. Now, what you're also going to see that also drives industrialization is corporations coming to dominate different industries. So this is where you see the big development of massive corporations that are going to be able to dominate their industries. And so some of these corporate companies, or some of these companies, are able to create monopolies in their industry, which is where one company completely dominates the industry and is able to wipe out their competitors. So a good example of that would have been like Standard Oil was able to kind of wipe out its competitors. On the other hand, you also have trusts develop in the era where different companies kind of in the same industry work together really to set and control prices to try and really work against the consumers at the benefit of the owners of companies. Now, certain ways that companies were able to knock out their competition were through vertical and horizontal integration. You can see that here in the chart. So vertical integration is really controlling each stage of production from the very beginning until the end of the finished product. And so like Carnegie with Carnegie Steel is a good example of vertical integration. On the other hand, horizontal integration is where you try to wipe out your competitors by either putting them out of business or buying them out. And so a good example of that was Standard Oil with Rockefeller. So you have different industrialists using different methods. Now, when we talked about these big industrialists, we talked about them in two different lights. Some people view them as these major captains of industry who are helping America to flourish and to prosper. America is going through some of its greatest economic expansion in the history of the nation, probably the greatest economic expansion in the history of the nation. Tremendous growth. The GDP is rising tremendously. In certain ways, the middle class is growing. And so you have an expansion of the nation, which is helping America on the international level and the national level become a more powerful country. So some people view these people as captains of industry. However, others kind of view them as this term robber barons, where they're kind of taking advantage of the poor, because at this time the gap between the working class and these wealthy elites is growing tremendously. And these people are going to end up being billionaires in a time period where the average industrial factory worker is making somewhere in the range of $600 a year. And so the disparity in wealth is just tremendous. So the key industrial figures you're looking at here, you have Rockefeller in oil, you have Andrew Carnegie in steel, you have Vanderbilt in the railroad industry, and J.P. Morgan in finance. These are just a few. There's somewhere in the range of about 100 billionaires in America, by the turn of the century. And so really the industrial age is helping to create a super wealthy elite class within the United States. Now, during this time period, there's all these different theories about society. And so we talked about a lot of these different theories. Some of them have to do with really like the differences that you see distributing as far as wealth is concerned. So these are some of the famous ones: the gospel of wealth, social Darwinism, scientific racism, this idea of rags to riches. So I'm going to briefly try and touch on each of them. This is a good thing for you guys to kind of dive deeper into on your own. The gospel of wealth is Andrew Carnegie's philosophy about wealthy and the people in poverty. And his idea is that wealthy should give back to society, but definitely not in a system of like a welfare system where you give to people who are poor. And he also doesn't really believe in raising people's wages unless he believes that they deserve their wages to be raised. His idea is to give back to society through great public works projects. And so he was famous for building libraries and universities. And his philosophy was that you could utilize those to pull yourself up out of poverty. It should be your responsibility to do this, not the wealthy's responsibility to directly necessarily improve your life by giving you money or giving you a raise. And so that's kind of Carnegie's philosophy here. And so it very much shows you that he believes in this idea of social Darwinism, these ideas of, I'm wealthy for a reason, and they're poor for a reason, and this kind of dichotomy in society. But he also kind of believes that a wealthy person shouldn't just hoard their wealth. They should try to improve society and give other people the potential benefit to move up the social ladder as well. Now, social Darwinism is becoming pervasive in some of these circles during the era of both industrialization and during imperialism. And it's this idea that basically the idea of taking Darwin's concept of the survival of the fittest and applying it to societies and applying it to people, and that wealthy people have become rich because they are the fittest of their race. And therefore, same thing applies in like industries. One company survives, another company fails because they are the fittest company. Scientific racism is kind of built off this idea of social Darwinism, so I would say to kind of look that up, but that's kind of building off of this concept of Darwinism and then applying what you find to these different races within America. That you see different ethnicities coming in, the new immigrants coming in, and applying it to different people in American society. And then also the American dream kind of becomes this idea of going from rags to riches, being born in poverty and being able to move up the social ladder and achieve maybe a wealthy status. And Carnegie's a good example of this, as somebody who was born very poor and is able to become a very wealthy individual through his own creation of a company. Now, in response to a lot of this inequality, what you're going to see is the development and beginning of some of the growth of labor unions. So the two famous labor unions during the time period are the Knights of Labor, founded by this man, Terence Powderly, and the American Federation of Labor, founded by this man, Samuel Gompers. So both of these labor unions are trying to fight for the rights of workers. The major difference here is that the Knights of Labor is really a little bit more, extreme in the sense that they're willing to strike more frequently in order to get what they want. And they're also much more inclusive. So they're willing to accept skilled and unskilled labor, white and black labor, women, immigrants into their union. And their philosophy is basically the more people you have in your union, the more strength that you have as a union. Now, on the other hand, you have the American Federation of Labor. And the American Federation of Labor with Samuel Gompers, their idea is that they only want to really let in skilled white labor into their union. And their philosophy is that when you have skilled labor, you essentially have more power and more of a bargaining chip. And they would try to rely on something called collective bargaining, which is where you try to negotiate, and they try to negotiate for better hours and better pay for their workers. The Knights of Labor is going to rely much more heavily on the strike. Now, what you're going to see in the late 1800s, the Gilded Age, is quite a few pretty violent, bloody strikes that break out. And these are just some of the famous ones, like the Great Railroad Strike and the Homestead Strike and the Pullman Strike. Now, a couple things you want to remember about the strikes of this era. First off, they do get pretty violent at times. And so the public kind of has this perception that labor unions are associated with violence. And they associate labor unions with radicalism and violence and socialism and these extreme ideologies in their eyes in society. The second thing is that during this time period, the federal government is not really on the side of labor. They really take the side of big business. And so in a lot of these strikes, they're going to send in the federal troops in order to suppress the strike and stop the strikers and to try and get the industries back up moving again, because the industries are seen as what's helping America to prosper and to help our country to grow through this industrialization. So that's an important thing to understand that will be different in later time periods in American history, like the Progressive era. Okay, so you also have some big social things happening in the North, primarily almost exclusively in the North. You have a new group of immigrants coming into America. So if you look here, this is kind of what we're talking about, late 1800s into the early 1900s. So the new immigrants come to America from 1880 to 1920. And this is our biggest influx of immigrants up until our modern era right now, which is a bigger influx of immigrants into the United States. So the new immigrants are largely coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. So from Southern Europe, you're primarily getting a lot of Italian immigrants, and from Eastern Europe, you're getting a lot of different Eastern European groups. A lot of Jewish immigrants are coming from Eastern Europe, from Russia and from Poland, and just some other Eastern European Catholics that are coming to the United States. So big things that are going to kind of come as a result of these groups of people. So you see some of the philosophies that we talked about earlier kind of like applied to these new immigrants. So you have the ideas of scientific racism kind of applied to them and kind of look down upon these different immigrants. These ideas of social Darwinism, again, kind of looking down on these different immigrant groups. There's also religious animosity towards these different groups because the Italians, the Southern Europeans are largely Catholics, and the immigrants coming from Eastern Europe are largely Jewish, and some are also Catholic as well. And so America is a dominantly Protestant country, and so you have religious animosity towards a lot of these immigrants as well. So you have this new immigrant group coming in, and ultimately what this is going to lead to in the 20s is these passing of these restrictive quota laws known as the National Origins Acts that restrict these immigrants. And if you look here, you have a massive decline in immigration in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and largely that's due to these quota laws that are passed as a result of this influx of immigrants that are coming into America. Now, on the political side, America is going to be facing a lot of corruption during the era. So this is a very famous cartoon that we looked at called The Bosses of the Senate. And a lot of these big, powerful industrialists, they have so much money and wealth, they're able to kind of influence their congressmen and senators using their wealth to their advantage. And so essentially this is done openly in certain cases, behind closed door in other cases. So a good example of this is like the railroad land grant scandals that happened during the Grant administration, where essentially like the railroad companies are trying to basically buy officials in the Grant administration to get them to give them land grants and to give them preferential treatment. And so things like that happen much more often during this Gilded Age time period. And so it's kind of seen as the industrialists are almost in control in certain ways of the legislative process. And you see that in the way that they're able to manipulate the government into, in certain cases, giving land grants for railroads or giving preferential treatment or having the government stay out of their labor disputes. Remember, the overarching economic philosophy of the era is laissez-faire, which is this idea of the government kind of staying hands off the economy. And the way that that's able to get implemented is because of heavy industrial pressure on these government officials to enact these ideas, to stay out of business practices and to not regulate it, to allow it to be practiced with this policy of laissez-faire. So the last thing we're going to take a look at is kind of on the local level. So on the local level, you also have massive corruption, maybe worse than on the federal level. So you're looking at here is Boss Tweed, who is a famous political machine boss here in New York City. And a lot of big cities had these political machines that really kind of controlled politics of the time period. And they would basically almost kind of buy the votes of these different immigrant groups coming into the cities by providing them services that didn't exist on the federal government level. And essentially what they would do is kind of like help them find a job or help them feed their family. And what they would expect in exchange is voting for certain political candidates. And so this is kind of par for the course in a lot of these big cities, and this is massive political corruption. And so what we're going to see in our next era is the progressive era try to fix a lot of these, not just political problems, but other social and economic problems developing during the Gilded Age. Okay, so we're going to wrap it there. On our next screencast, we'll jump into time period 7.